In our previous lesson, we learned the difference between outset and inset box shadows. We discovered that an outset shadow appears outside the element, while an inset shadow appears inside it. We also created two inset shadows together to give our element a more realistic inner effect. But in this lesson, we're going to simplify things again. Let's remove the second inset shadow we added in the previous lesson and leave only the first inset shadow. This will make it easier to understand how the different box shadow properties behave when we're using an inset shadow. But here's something you might be wondering. Do the shadow properties behave differently when we're using an inset shadow? Let's find out. We'll continue using the first inset shadow we created in the previous lesson. Look at the screen. Let's start with the horizontal offset. Increase the horizontal offset little by little. Notice what happens. The shadow still moves horizontally, just like it did with an outset shadow. The difference is that it never leaves the element. Instead, it moves across the inside of the box. Now change the value to a negative number. Notice that the shadow moves in the opposite direction. So the horizontal offset still works exactly the same. The only difference is that the shadow always remains inside the element. Next, let's look at the vertical offset. Increase the value. Notice that the shadow moves downward inside the box. Now make it negative. It moves upward instead. Again, the rule hasn't changed. The shadow still moves vertically. It's simply moving inside the element instead of outside it. Now let's try the blur radius. Increase the blur radius. Notice how the edges become softer and smoother. Reduce it again. The edges become sharper. Just like before, the blur radius still controls how soft the shadow looks. Now, let's move on to the property that creates the biggest visual difference, the spread radius. In our previous lessons, we learned that an outset shadow appears outside the element. With the spread radius set to 0px, the shadow follows the shape of the element and appears behind it, creating that solid shadow shape we can clearly see. Let's see what happens when we use the same idea with an inset shadow. Before we continue, let's set the horizontal and vertical offsets to 0 pixels. This will make it easier to clearly see what the spread radius is doing. So now, increase the spread radius. Now look at the screen. Notice that the shadow becomes thicker from every side of the element. Instead of growing outside the box, it grows inward from all 4 edges. As it keeps expanding, less and less of the element's original background remains visible again. Keep increasing the value. Eventually, the shadow covers almost the entire inside of the element because it has nowhere else to go. Now let's try a negative spread radius. Reduce the value. Notice that the shadow becomes thinner from every side of the element. More of the element's original background becomes visible again. So the spread radius still follows the same rule. A positive value makes the shadow larger. A negative value makes it smaller. The biggest difference is where that growth happens. With an outset shadow, the shadow grows outside the element and can even appear as a solid shadow shape behind it. With an inset shadow, the shadow grows inward from every edge, gradually covering more of the element's background while always remaining inside the box. That's the biggest difference between the two. Now that we understand how the different box shadow properties behave when we're using an inset shadow, it's time to combine everything we've learned. Can we use outset and inset shadows together on the same element to create even more realistic and premium-looking designs? That's exactly what we're going to build in the next lesson. If this lesson makes sense, comment, "I understand inset shadow properties." Also, don't forget to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next lesson.